Nick James, welcome to Inspire By.
You promised me that I was gonna share stuff in this episode that I'd never shared before. You've already succeeded. I've got a very different relationship with my mum and dad. So I'm not as close to my dad as I am my mum, that's just a fact. And I saw this massive transformation in my mum. Successful on paper, high-flying corporate career, but not happy. And over the course of probably a year or two, I saw this massive transformation in her. In 1994, when I saw Tony Robbins in Hawaii, that was the first time I was like, wow, I don't know what's going on here really, but I want to do that.
Now, what I hear a lot of entrepreneurs say is things like, oh, it's too late now, I should have done it then.
Should is a dangerous word.
Yeah.
Maybe try just exchanging that word for could. Do you know how I got Grant Cardone? I just phoned. I literally just went on his website and went, oh, there's a phone number, I'll just phone it and see what happens.
Nick James, welcome to Inspire By.
Chloë, thanks for having me.
How's it going?
I say thanks for having me. We're in my office, so it feels weird to say thanks for having me, but thanks for having me on the show.
Well, actually, I was going to mention that because it must feel a bit weird because you've obviously had your podcast for quite a while. It's fair to say you've interviewed a lot of big names, so it must be quite nice being on the other side.
Yeah, it means I don't have to really think too much about the flow of the interview, about what questions to ask. Like, I'm in your hands. So
that's what I love.
Let's go.
So obviously, as I mentioned, you have interviewed a lot of people.
Yeah.
Where did your love for speaking, doing podcasts, and actually speaking to celebrities and the guests you've spoken to come from?
Well, there's like three questions in one.
Yeah.
So where did my love for speaking come from? That's a long story, starting off in 1994 when I saw Tony Robbins in Hawaii. Like, that's a long time ago, and that's what... that was the first time I was like, wow, I don't know what's going on here really, but I want to do that.
Yeah.
So that was my kind of love of speaking, but interviewing and then podcasting really. So interviewing speakers that we'd book for our events. So interviewing them in the lead up to the event for promotional purposes, and then sometimes interviewing them on stage at the events. And it was only much later that I started the podcast because a mutual friend of ours, Rob Moore, there's a little name drop, a little ad for Rob, basically for years was like, when are you going to do a podcast? When are you going to do a podcast? When are you going to do a podcast? Because he was like, you're already paying huge fees to have these speakers on stage at your events. I'm sure rolled into that agreement, you could get an interview with them for 30, 45 minutes, whatever, for no extra cost. And you'd have a banging podcast with loads of amazing guests. And I was like, yeah, I haven't really got the time, busy with the events. And then a little thing called lockdown happened and I couldn't run any events. So I was like, well, now might be a good time to do the podcast. So fortunately, what we actually were able to do, because obviously we've got the recordings of all of the Expert Empires events we've ever done, I already had quite a lot of content in the can that hadn't been created specifically for the purpose of a podcast, but could be repurposed, just topped and tailed. And then since then, obviously, we've started building that into the strategy when we book speakers. Some speakers, as you know, having attended Expert Empires, they speak in interview kind of fireside chat format, and then that becomes a podcast episode. So it's been cool. Jav, how many episodes are we on now? Podcast?
151.
Is it?
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Yeah,
151.
So 151. And by the way, full transparency, like probably 140 of those, it's not that high. I'm exaggerating. 140 of those were not like, this is a podcast episode. It's not that high. I'm not that lazy. But there's probably a significant chunk of those that are repurposed interviews I've done on stage at Expert Empires, or episodes that I've been interviewed on other people's podcasts like this, snippets from me speaking on stage, things like that. So yeah, I haven't sat there and recorded 151 episodes in a studio, just to be clear.
Yeah, interesting. And you mentioned there about the fact that you were interviewing lots of celebrities on stage and you'd done a lot of talks on stage first, but you didn't start the podcast till later. Now, what I hear a lot of entrepreneurs say is things like, oh, it's too late now, I should have done it then. How did you overcome that to go, do you know what, actually, now's the right time, let's just go through it, and it doesn't matter that I didn't start it from the beginning?
Yeah, first of all, should is a dangerous word.
Yeah.
Because it presupposes that like you've made a mistake or you've done something wrong, especially when you use it past tense, I should have done this. or in the present tense, we should be doing that. Like, maybe try just exchanging that word for could. I could have started the podcast a lot earlier. I could have. I didn't. I chose to when the time felt right. If I'd started it earlier, would we be on more episodes? Yes. Would we have more downloads? Yes. Would we be higher in the charts? Yes. Would I have had a load of other benefits that I've had since I started the podcast? Yes. But I didn't. So there's no point in saying I should have done it sooner. I could have, but I didn't, and that's fine. Who knows? If I'd done it sooner, maybe it would have tanked. Like, we just don't know, do we? So, I'm kind of very philosophical about it. That said, had I done it sooner, do I think it would be bigger, better? Yeah, I do. So, I could have listened to Rob earlier and started the podcast earlier, and I think that would have been a good call had I done it.
Now, I just wanted to quickly interrupt this episode to share a quick message with you. Now, I've been hosting these interviews with Inspired by Show for a while now, and I've been loving all of the great feedback from our listeners. And it really means a lot when you all share from listening to these episodes, watching these episodes, share your incredible feedback. And I love that you love it as much as we do. Now, my mission for the Inspired by Show is to inspire others to challenge the norm, share their story, knowing that it's okay to be vulnerable and, shock horror, take the mask off and be raw and real. So I have a favour to ask. Can you help me on this mission by sharing this episode with someone who you think needs to hear this message? Maybe there's a friend, a loved one, a colleague, or someone that you know that would really benefit from hearing this inspiring story. If you could do that to help us, help even more people to challenge the norm and push themselves out of their own comfort zone, then I'd really appreciate it. So if you haven't already, share this episode with a friend, a loved one, a colleague, or someone that you know would benefit. Now, back to the episode. Yeah. And I think this comes back down to not always looking for the right time, but just feeling when it's a good time.
Yeah.
Because
and the whole missing the boat thing, like, you don't really know. And there's plenty of, there's no doubt that when it comes to starting a podcast or getting onto a social media channel or anything like that, there is an advantage to being an early adopter, without doubt. The point is, if you're an early adopter, we don't really know whether or not it's going to pan out and be worthwhile. Like, the first people that got into Instagram and started building their following took a risk, didn't know whether that was going to pan out to be a huge social media platform. They could have put loads of time in and loads of energy and then been, well, that was a complete waste of time. That's the risk you take. And then if you wait, the risks are lower, but the rewards are lower as well. So it depends upon timing and your appetite for risk reward, I think.
And also your approach. So for me, I'm never an early adopter, not because I don't want to, but I'm always just a bit like, I need to have everything else organised first. For you, I found that was quite different when you started events, because you were one of the few to bring up some big celebrities. And you always have this thing, Nick, where in Expert Empires, it's very rare you'll have someone on stage that's already big and done a lot of speaking in the UK. You tend to bring over people from the US for the first time. How did you step into that arena as an early adopter and let's be fair, took a fair big risks to do that?
Yeah, I think it was probably born out of, even though, yes, you could argue that I was an early adopter in terms of bringing big name speakers from not just the US, all over the world into the UK. And having said that, I'd been running events for years. So it wasn't like Expert Empires in 2017 was my first rodeo. Yeah. I did my first event in 2008. I'd been working in the events industry virtually almost my entire life. As a volunteer at Tony Robbins events throughout my teenage years, then working with another mutual friend of ours, Andy Harrington, initially in sales, then did some speaking for him in marketing. I knew the events business back to front, inside out. So it wasn't like it was it was risky, but it wasn't as big a risk, so I understood it. And, even then, the financial outlay of, speaker fees, and at my events I talk about the financial model and, how I made it all work and how the events make financial sense and how they stack up. I don't think it was as big a risk. At the time, it didn't feel as big a risk as everyone thought it was, or even everyone thinks it was now. At the time, I'm not gonna lie, committing to spend 200 grand on an event when I didn't have 200 grand, I'm not gonna lie, it was a little bit nerve wracking. but I had a deep sense of certainty and self-belief that I was going to make that work. And also, I guess, it was born out of a frustration that I was observing this industry that I'd been brought up on, like literally was raised in the personal development events industry, and I'd kind of fallen out of love with it a little bit, and I felt there was a lot of people that were in it for the wrong reasons, and look, I hold my hands up, I, at some point, probably between 2012 and 2015, in that little period of my career, was running events with not much focus on quality and a lot more focus on money. And so I was like, I took a look at myself, I looked at the industry and went, this doesn't feel good. What needs to change? And then maybe I can be the person that facilitates that change and does it a bit different, which is what we did.
You mentioned there that you were born into the personal development industry. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so you know what, whenever I tell this story, I always think to myself, what if? Like, what if this hadn't happened? So my mum was, when I was a kid, I would have been like 12 years of age, early 90s. She was working in a corporate career. She was HR director for a big publicly traded company. And the story she tells is a guy walks into her office who's one of her direct reports and goes, "You've got to read this book." And he starts telling her about this book written by a guy called Tony Robbins. And he's like, "You're going to love it, it's going to change your life, blah, blah, blah." And she takes the book, puts it on the shelf, doesn't read it for like a year. A year later, she's going through a really tough time personally, and for whatever reason, she just went, "I'm going to read the book." Like, just on a whim, just for no real reason. The book had been sat there for a year, reads the book, absolutely loves it. She ends up taking her kind of direct reports, her and like 5 people, to Tony Robbins' Unleash the Power Within event. Absolutely changes her life, loves every minute of it, buys everything, like I do and like you do as well. Just buys everything.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, exactly. And so goes on the Tony Robbins Mastery University training, which is like a significant investment, lots of different trainings all over the world. She invested in that. But back then, they also had, this is smart by the way, and I'm actually surprised people don't do it. Maybe we should do it. And I don't think Tony Robbins even does it anymore. They used to run alongside the main event a kids camp. Because obviously the objection to purchasing what was then $10,000, and we're talking 30 years ago, so probably the equivalent of what would it be, like 40 grand now. The big barrier is, yes, it's 40 grand, but it's also probably 3 or 4 weeks across the year away from my family, all over the world, travel expense, all that sort of stuff. So let's take that problem away by providing essentially childcare while you're there. And it was more than childcare, it was almost like a personal development seminar for kids that ran alongside the main training. And so, I attended that when I was 12, and then kind of as I got a bit older, attended all the kind of Tony Robbins, Unleash the Power Within, Mastery University, ended up working as a volunteer in that organisation for a number of years. So yeah, I've never totaled it up. It must be, it'd be in the hundreds of days over the course of maybe 9 years, hundreds of days, in amazing locations all over the world with my mum at personal development seminars. Wow. And so, even though of course I was, at school in between that time, and had a great kind of traditional upbringing, I was at the same time every so often, probably 4 times a year, something like that, travelling all over the world to these amazing places, being in a great environment.
That's incredible. And
it's cool.
Shout out to your mum as well, because not many parents would do that for their children, and I'm sure that's a huge impact on your mindset growing up.
Yeah, massively, and I think, even though of course she was investing heavily in her own personal development, she also invested heavily in mine as well, because it's not cheap. But equally, single parent at the time, I think she wanted me to be part of that. I think she would probably say me going with her was as much for her as it was for me, probably. But it also meant that, between the age of 12 and 19, I spent a lot of time with my mum, just us, which I don't think many kids do, certainly many boys do in particular, which was really great. It was great for our relationship.
I was just about to ask that question because I was very close to my mum growing up as well, and my parents divorced, and I went away with my mum a lot on holidays, and we had a really strong relationship. Now, I'm interested, Nick, because I've heard you tell the story before, but what I find fascinating is that not many kids listen to their parents growing up, right? So a lot of kids can go, oh, you get taken on a holiday, oh, but mum, I don't want to do that. What did you ever go, oh, mum, I can't be asked, obviously not that language, or were you always on board with it?
Yeah, I think initially it was 2 weeks in Hawaii, out of school, so it was quite appealing. But later, I remember specifically there was, I forget when it was, there was an event, might have been in America, but I don't recall, and I wasn't sure about going, because at the time I had, I've always been really into my sport, and I think at the time I had either a big golf match or a big football match. One of the two, and I was like, I'm gonna miss it, and that was a bit of a cross. I had to make a decision. I was at a bit of a crossroads, going what do I take more seriously here? Do I take this or that more seriously? And I elected to go on the trip and miss the whatever it was, golf or football match. Interestingly, I've got a vivid memory of playing in a semi-final of a football, it was a football tournament, and we got to the semi-final, and me and my mum went to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and we scheduled the flight and got back just in time, literally, right? We flew into, I guess it was probably Heathrow, got straight in the car, drove back to Birmingham, and I got changed in the car, and I got there at half time, and I came on as a sub at half time. So it was one of those where it was totally, I wanted to do both, and so, we kind of had to be creative. And the question I always ask whenever you've got a situation like that is, how can we have it all?
Yeah.
How can we have that and that? Yeah. It's not an either or.
I've heard you say that actually when you mentor us a lot. You're going, hang on, why is it option one or option two? How can you have both?
Yeah, we had that conversation yesterday at Mastermind. I can't remember what the context was now.
Yeah, exactly.
It was how could... Well, it's not why can't we, it's how can we have it all? And sometimes that's not possible, but at least ask the question and explore the possibilities. I'm guessing we probably looked at the event schedule, the flight schedule, the time of the match, and went, how can we have it all? And went, this is going to be tight. I mean, if the flight had been delayed, would have been traffic on the way back, we'd have been rushing for nothing. I'd have got there just at full time or something, but it was cool.
And your relationship with your mum has continued to flourish, because not only did she then support you throughout your journey of personal development, then she came on board within Expert Empires. Yeah,
so one of the greatest experiences, challenging, not going to lie, but greatest experiences I've had in business was in, when would it have been, 2018, I think. My mum, Nikki V, and her husband, Tony V, they'd built up their kind of coaching business, and it got to a point in their life where they were at a bit of a crossroads going, don't really know what we want to do with this, and it's really hard work because we don't like doing the sales and the marketing and the operations. We just want to coach people, we just want to inspire people, and they're so good at that. And I like to think I'm fairly good at the other stuff. So, we kind of brokered a bit of a deal where their business came into Expert Empires, and they ended up coaching, speaking, doing the things they're amazing at, and taking on other kind of senior roles in the business around client experience and event management, the things that they're world class at, absolutely world class at. And we had, what would it have been, 2.5 great years where, I spent so much time with them over those 2.5 years. Most people in their late 30s then probably don't spend that much time with their parents. They might see them at the weekend, or whatever, go around for Sunday lunch, that sort of thing maybe. But I was seeing them every single day. And look, was it challenging at times? Yes. But, we got to spend all that time together, and, they added massive value to our businesses. And then, last year they kind of reached a point where they went, hey, you know what, we're now pushing, they won't love me for saying this, getting towards 70, not actually at 70 yet, but getting towards 70. And, by the way, working in our companies is intense. When we're obviously fast growing, highly ambitious, it's intense. And they're like, man, we need to slow down. And so, they've now, I say retired, but it's really semi-retired. And as we speak, they're cruising all around the world So they started off in Australia, then went through to Hawaii, where, funnily enough, my mum visited the place where we started with Tony Robbins at that hotel and videoed it, and it's actually not changed that much. It was really, like, I remember I watched the video, I got goosebumps.
Really?
I mean, I've not been there since, it's actually later on, we were at that same venue for a Tony Robbins seminar when 9/11 happened. So there's a lot of significant memories there. And I saw the video of them. So they went and visited the hotel, that was cool. And now they're cruising. They went to California and through Panama, and now they're cruising all over the place and having a great time. And still, like, coaching people and doing the things they love, on Zoom and stuff. When they dock and they get into a hotel with good internet, they're still managing to do a bit of that. But they're loving their semi-retirement. They'll never fully retire. They're just too obsessed with what they do. There's no chance. But like I said, it was a great experience for me. Challenging at times as a leader of a business to have your mum and her husband. I call them my parents because Tony and I are very close. So it's challenging, but equally I'm like, hey, if I can lead those people, then leading people that I'm not that close with has got to be a lot easier because you haven't got all the emotional background. So a lot of fun.
How did you handle that dynamic though? Leading, managing, quote, your parents, and what was the biggest challenge you faced going through that? Biggest lesson by far was the dynamic of our leadership team. So at that point we had leadership team consisted of obviously myself as the CEO, and then I had my mum as like head of the event. She was like event director. We run a lot of events, 150, 200 days worth of events per year. So really that in itself is a significant role. Tony was like the kind of head of client experience and making sure all the clients feel loved, which he was born to do. And then Ad was and still is head of marketing. Jack was and still is head of sales. So that was the leadership team. Then Shelley, I think, joined the leadership team during that process as head of people, I think. So my biggest lesson was that when you're leading a team of people, there's a very delicate balance between having like a deep connection with each individual person and leading them in a kind of unique way that works for them versus having what we might call favourites or treating people differently based upon your relationship. So the biggest thing I remember it was a complete blind spot for me, but I remember catching myself doing it. Because they're my parents, we would, go around to their house, take, two boys, their grandkids round at the weekend, and, we'd have Sunday roast or we'd go out for food or whatever. And, we would talk business because you can't help it when you're so obsessed with it and all in. First of all, my wife now hated it because she's like, can we just have some family time and not talk about business? So that was a challenge. And then the second thing was we would have conversations in that environment that the other members of the leadership team weren't privy to. And so inadvertently, I was creating a bit of favoritism. And you go, well, they're your parents. Obviously, you've got a deeper relationship. And you'd be right, but still, I had to kind of make a rule. I learned from my mistakes and made a bit of a rule that was like, hey, family time's family time. We don't get into work conversations in that space, in that environment. A, because it's not good for the family dynamic, and B, because it's not good for the leadership team dynamic either. And I remember actually when they kind of finally semi-retired, and my mum was like, I remember saying to me, she was like, I'm really looking forward to just being your mum again. And I was like that. And actually, you know what? I feel like whilst there was a lot of great stuff and we had a great 2.5 years, whatever it was, I think actually it had run its course and our relationship is probably better for it now. Even though I haven't seen them for like 4 months. But, we're still in touch on, WhatsApp and we Zoom or FaceTime occasionally when we can. But yeah, I think the relationship's better for it. Yeah. It's better because we had that experience and worked together so closely for those couple of years, and it's also better because we don't anymore. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You've had the great stuff, but now you're coming out the other side with a different dynamic.
Yeah, of course.
Now, obviously, you and your mum's relationship, as you said, has been very strong throughout your childhood, and she took you on an incredible journey of development. What have you used with that to bring up your own sons now?
Oh, good question. I think what I learned from my mum, which was brilliant, was she never forced me to get into personal development. She never kind of tried to persuade me to do it. This is the advice I often have the question, when we do Q&As and stuff, like what advice would you give to parents that want to get their kids into personal development? Or indeed, what advice would you give to anyone who wants to get their mum, dad, son, daughter, niece, nephew, best friend, whoever into personal development? And my answer is always the same: go first, be the example. And I saw this massive transformation in my mum, massive, from unhappy in her career. She wouldn't mind me saying, single, lonely, unhealthy, successful on paper, high-flying corporate career, but not happy. And over the course of probably a year or two, I saw this massive transformation in her. And then when she went, hey, I'm going to Hawaii for 2 weeks, you want to come? I'm like, first of all, it's 2 weeks out of school. Second of all, whatever has happened here, I want that. And so for me, it's always be the example, lead, go first. The phrase that we use a lot is inspire, don't require. So rather than you must do this, I want you to do this, it's like, hey, inspire, lead by example, and then, let things take their natural course.
Yeah. And your sons both attend Expert Empires, which I love. Every time I see them, I'm like, when the first came, I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. But fantastic, because they also learn a lot from being around the people.
The only downside is some of the speakers swear a lot. So I've got, my 10-year-old and now they're 10 and 14, but they've been coming to the events a long time. Ty, my 10-year-old, likes to count the swear words. The current record holder is Rob Moore. That won't surprise you. There you go, Rob. Got 2 shout-outs in this episode. He's the current record holder. So they come to the Expert Empires events. I've given them an opportunity, which they both took, to go through a kids' personal development course that one of our clients actually runs, which I think is amazing. His name's Tom Owens. You should definitely, if you've got kids between 9 and 13, I think is the age range, you should definitely check Tom out. Tom Owens on Instagram. He's a football coach. That's his main business, but he does a mindset academy for kids.
Wow.
And Zach's been through it twice, I think. And Ty just did it. So I'm always, whenever anything like that shows up, I give them the option. And what's interesting is they've always said yes. But I think the reason they've always said yes is because they've been drip-fed bits here and there. They've been to Expert Empires, twice a year for the last... Ty hasn't always come because he's only 10 now. I think he was probably 7 when he first came to Expert Empires. But, they've been to a lot of those events. They think it's super cool to meet Stephen Bartlett and Joe Wicks and, the kind of Instagram celebrities. So that's quite cool for them. Their mates at school are like, you met Stephen Bartlett, oh, that's amazing, and they've got the photos on socials and all that kind of jazz. So that's cool. But obviously they pick things up, don't they? Kids are like sponges, and a lot of the things that we've implemented in our business that have helped us have a relative level of success, I've also tried to implement at home as well. So we've got a set of family values, and in fact just a couple of days ago we did our kind of family values and goals review. So at the start of every year we do a goal setting process. I've been using the same process for 20 years probably. Wow. And so we now do that every year as a family. Normally it's my mum and Tony, me and Nat and the kids. Obviously the kids only started participating as they got a little bit older. We review our previous year, we set our goals for the next year, we capture them, and then we review our progress month on month. So we just had a little family meeting. It's not as formal as it sounds. We just did it over dinner the other night, and we kind of went through our goals and gave a little update and how we're doing, and there were some where we're falling short and what do we need to do to catch up on them. And then also, the family values. We did a little exercise to see who could remember them off by heart. We did pretty good, not 100%, but pretty good. And then, talked about what we're doing well around these values, what do we think we could do better. So stuff like that, I think, it just kind of, it brings, I guess you'd call it personal development, self-improvement, whatever, into everyday life, rather than, I think the problem with personal development, quite frankly, is certainly, less so now, but many years ago, you'd go to a seminar. That was pretty much the only way you could absorb personal development, or you'd listen to a tape set. You're probably too young for tape sets. But, and you'd get this hit, and then you're going back into everyday life and it kind of wear off. And then you'd have to go again to get a hit. Whereas now, you've got so much material, podcasts, audio books that you can consume daily. It's much more accessible now than it was. But I do think the consistency is key, rather than just going and getting your fix once a year at a seminar or something like that. I think consistency is key.
Yeah, and that's one of my pet peeves about the personal development space, is because that's how a lot of people have made money. It's like you have to get your next fix, you have to keep coming back, and actually it's about having other avenues so you're not codependent, right? Because I think there's a lot of codependency in the space. And one of the questions I've got for you, Nick, is obviously you, your mum, Tony, all into this industry. Then you've got the family meetings, you've got your kids brought into it. How did Nat feel coming into this? Like, was there any point at where she's going, these people are all crazy?
So, by the way, you promised me that I was gonna share stuff in this episode that I'd never shared before. You've already succeeded. There's already been a load of stuff. You know what? When you said that to me yesterday, I was like, yeah, everyone says that, but I'm not sure. But you have got a very good talent for doing that. So, interesting story with Nat. We met at uni. So we were both at Nottingham Trent University. I'm a year older than her, so I was in my second year, she was in her first year at uni. We met drunk on the dance floor of a nightclub, like where all great love stories start, of course. She came on to me. I know you're wondering that question. And very early on in our relationship, I think we were a month in, and I went to Australia for 10 days, 2 weeks for a Tony Robbins seminar. So, Date with Destiny, and I was actually working at that event as a volunteer. So straight away, she's like, well, what are you doing in Australia, right? So I told her, and she was kind of interested. And then there was an Unleash the Power Within event happening, let's say 3 or 4 months later in London. And obviously, and I was going to work at that as well. And I was like, you want to come? I can get you a ticket. And she was like, I'd love to. I'm really interested in it. And, and I think from her point of view, she was like, I know this is a big part of your life. So, and it was one of those where our relationship got, even though, we were very young and at uni, it got quite serious quite quick. So, we, I think, probably knew very early that, like, we were going to be together long term. And I think Nat was like, well, this is a big part of your life. So, I want to be part of it and see what it's all about. Maybe she was thinking, I want to check it's not a weird cult, because if it is, I'm going to run. But either way, she came to the Tony Robbins UPW event, and she then kind of volunteered at some of those events with me in the years that followed. So and I'd say Nat's probably not as heavy into personal development as I am. But at the same time, she still, has adopted a lot of the philosophies and the kind of approaches that you hear from people like Tony Robbins, or when you learn. She did a NLP practitioner certification years and years ago, and when I was working for Andy Harrington, we were together then, and so she would come and attend those events and help out at those events, and even in the holidays come and work in Andy's office. So she's been around it like constantly for the last, best part of 20 years.
I think it's so important though with relationships, because I've seen, and I'm sure loads of people have experienced this, where one person is developing and the other person isn't, and that can cause a shift and a big hole, right?
Yeah. Well, it's really what it is it's a fundamental misalignment of values, and so all it really does is it magnifies that misalignment of values. The problem happens where you go, the person I met and got into a relationship with is no longer the same person. I'm not sure I like this version. And so then, the relationship inevitably does end. And I've seen that many, many times. And do I think that relationships ending is a bad thing? Not always. My mum and dad, they separated when I was 3, 4. That is a good thing. Like, they would not be the people they are. I would not be the person I am if they'd stayed together. But now I go, how did that even happen? Like, they are not matched. They are not compatible at all. But it did, and but I think them separating was a good thing. Yeah. Like, certainly not a bad thing. So I don't think people are meant to be together forever. I think sometimes relationships run their course, like business partnerships run their course, client relationships run their course. Like, it's not always a disaster when people separate. Sometimes it's for the best.
Yeah, I totally relate. My parents divorced when I was 10 and it was very traumatic, I'm not going to lie. But I look back and I think sometimes people go, oh, what would you do if your parents got back together? Freak out, to be really honest.
Yeah.
It'd be so surreal. Yeah,
absolutely.
What? That should, it's just, it's.
Yeah, and there's just no way, and I love both my parents. My dad lives up north, he's like happy, like got a really kind of stable, simple life, loves his, he's in his 70s, he's retired now, but he's really happy. My mum is cruising around the world. They couldn't be more opposite, and she's really happy. But I go, if they were still together, he would not be doing what he's doing, and she would not be doing what she's doing, and they'd probably both be miserable. So, for the best.
Was it ever weird having your mum in the company and that sort of different relationship with your mum versus your dad?
I've got a very different relationship with my mum and dad. Like, to be fair, me and my dad, I wouldn't say we're not close. We speak probably every week or so on the phone. He lives quite a long way away. I go and see him a couple of times a year. So I'm not as close to my dad as I am my mum. That's just a fact. But I don't think it was weird because throughout the personal development journey, me and my mum, it was our thing, really. Interestingly, my dad, he went through a really tough time when I was probably 18, 19. And I bought him a ticket to UPW, to Tony Robbins event, and he came, loved it. Really? He did make some significant changes to his life as a result of that. So, so he's got a vague understanding of what I do, but it'd be vague. He doesn't really understand it. Whereas my mum obviously worked in the company for a few, 2.5 years, and has been a big part of it. So she knows what I do, what we do, back to front, inside out. So it's different.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating though, where parents, they're still the parents, but the child becomes the leader or the trainer or the guide, right? Because that's what you've done with your dad. You got him to UPW. Both my parents confided in me in crazy amounts, and I always think, at what point did this switch? Well,
what's interesting is I think it's actually just nature. Like, if you think about, I'm guessing in all, in the animal kingdom, in forget like the fact that of course you've built a successful business and you've worked on yourself a lot. I know over many years, as I have. I think naturally, when you're born, your parents look after you, and when you die, your kids look after you. Pretty much, like that's normal, really, isn't it? So I think it's and when does that switch happen is different depending upon health, depending upon the individuals and their mindset and how rapidly they've grown or learned, their financial success. All of these things are factors that determine at what point that switch happens. But I think it naturally does. And of course, in some cases more so than others. My dad lives, like I said, up north. He's in a relationship with an amazing woman. They're really happy. And like, it's funny because I don't really see that it would be my job to look after him.
Interesting.
Whereas what's interesting is, in my mum's case, I feel like it would be. Like, because we all, because we've always been real close, and like, my nan passed away last year, and she lived in my mum's house. Well, put it this way, my nan and granddad moved into my mum's house with me and my mum when I was 14. So I lived with my grandparents up until I left home, which was when I was like 18 to go to uni. So, like that part of her looking after them, again, at what point did that happen? I guess when she bought a house for us to live in, And then that was the case until they both passed away. So, you know, that dynamic happened. And to be fair, it was mutually beneficial because my mum was a single parent, and it meant that I had, when she was away on business, which was quite often, and, you know, she would, you know, work late nights, all sorts of things, I had a solid family unit. I had a home and my grandparents there. And so I think that was a good arrangement for everybody, really, because it meant that they were looked after financially, I was looked after, had a good solid family unit. So I think with everybody that dynamic shifts, but it's kind of normal, like that most, at some point in your life, your kids end up being the, whatever you want to call it, the, you know, the provider, the mentor, the caregiver, whatever you want to call it. I think that's fairly normal. It's just at what point does that happen?
It's interesting though, Nick, because family is obviously quite clearly important to you, as is business and growth, because big pieces of your life. Obviously, you've merged the two before with your mum and Tony coming in. Would you ever merge them again, like if the boys wanted to come and work at Expert Empires?
Yeah, 100%. I've already said, by the way, both my boys are still on the we want to be professional footballers.
Which and we're going to follow that,
which
right?
I'm totally supportive of. Like, I have never, will never tell them they can't do something. I'm like, yeah, you can. And what's interesting is I actually think, I see this, I think there are kids who are more talented that have already been told they're not going to make it by their parents or by people around them. And I'm like, you can. You've got to work really hard and be consistent, and it might not come to you tomorrow, but work hard and you'll get there, and I believe that. So would I bring them into the business? Yes, 100%. You know, we've got a rapidly growing team, we're always hiring. We've been advertising for quite some time. We made a hire recently, brought someone into the marketing team to do media buyer, so run paid advertising, that sort of thing. And I said at the time, I went, if this was 4 years into the future, I'd just offer Zach the role, 100%, because I know him, I know how his brain works, and I think he would smash it. He'd be brilliant at that. As soon as I feel that Ty's old enough to get on the phone and make sales calls, he'll be all over it. When it comes to Expert Empires, he literally sticks to the sales team like glue.
Really?
Yeah, he's just that kind of kid. Yeah. You know, he's the life and soul of the party. He has got great chat, to be fair, and he's got good confidence. So I think he'd be brilliant in sales. He's born to do that sort of role. But equally, I don't have any kind of rule that they have to. I think if they want to make their own way and go to uni or start their own business, any of those things, they'll have my complete support. Equally, if they go, hey, I'd like to come and work for you or in your business, then yeah, 100%. I'd certainly hire them. And they wouldn't get any special treatment. Yeah. No chance. In fact, they're probably going to have to work twice as hard and generate twice the result everybody else is just to get the same amount of recognition, praise, reward, money, everything. Because I'll be more demanding of them than I am of anyone else.
What's the reason for that then?
I think it's probably how I parent, really. I just got high standards. Even when I'm watching them play football and they have a good game, I can't help it. I'll be in the car after the game and I've got better, definitely got better, and I'll go, look, here's what you did really well, and here are the things, like this is not good enough. You need to work on this. And I can't help it. I hold them to a much higher standard. Whereas when I watch the other kids playing, I'll go, that was brilliant. I don't see the stuff that they get wrong or that they could do better. It's funny. I've just got really high standards.
But a lot of people
but by the way, I've done that for myself for pretty much my whole life. So it's just kind of who I am, I guess.
And that's exactly what I was about to say next, because I think a lot of us have high standards, people we care about, because we also have high standards for us. And arguably, you probably have the highest standards for yourself.
Yeah, 100%. And I think generally we will be more likely and willing to hold people accountable the more we care about them. Yeah. So, I will hold them accountable. They're my kids. I love them and that more than anything in the world. And I go, I will hold them to account and hold their standards right up here more than anybody. The people that I'm closest with in the business, I find it easier to hold them accountable and to call them to higher standards than I do the people that I know less well. So I think that's generally the people you're closest with, you probably find it easy to hold accountable. Also, to be honest, they're also the people that don't always see the best side of me. Whereas the people that I don't know as well, they always see the best side of me.
Yeah.
So they probably get the best and the worst of me. Yeah. Is the truth.
And that's so common for so many people. Yeah. I see it all the time. Now, you mentioned about having high standards for yourself. You've obviously gone to do that with Expert Empires and more. Where did Expert Empires, the idea of running these events, because you've always had high standards for yourself with these events, I've seen it from the first event you ran. Yeah. Where did it come from?
I think probably all the way back to Tony Robbins 1994. Like, by the way, if you've never been to a Tony Robbins event, you have.
I've only been to the online ones during COVID.
You've not been to a live one.
No.
You've got to go. Especially, as a speaker and somebody that runs their own events, I think, just go and see an absolute master at work. But also, it's not just Tony and how good he is. Yeah. It's the whole show, the whole event, the whole everything, the whole experience. So, like I said, I saw that for many, many years, and I worked in it for many, many years. So, the standards there are insanely high. And so I just kind of adopted those same standards. And even now, I know that probably my greatest fault as a leader is nothing's ever good enough or perfect. Like I will walk into a room, especially at the events is the worst bit. I walk into a room for an event, either here at our training centre or an Expert Empires event, or when we do a retreat or something. I'll walk into the room, but the first thing I'll notice is the thing that's not quite right. Like I can't help it. And the standards and the attention to detail in the Tony Robbins world were unreal. And I tell you, the other person who's got the highest standards I've ever seen around this, in fact, it's not one person, it's my mum and Tone. Like they're, I'd say probably my mum's standards are like mine, and how she communicates is like how I do it. But the attention to detail, Tony V, is unreal. Wow. So when we started running our events, Expert Empires, the first one in 2017, they weren't like part of the company then, but I got them to come to. My mum was the event director, and Tone was there he wasn't kind of an official role, but he was also there, and like they owned just making everything look and feel amazing. Because obviously I can't do that and run the show and be the speaker. I kind of need, and they're so good at that. So I think it was partly just being around world-class events for a very long time, and partly their influence on the Expert Empires events. Like you wouldn't believe the attention to detail. What's funny is you walk into a room and you wouldn't even notice, but unconsciously you do. Yeah. So like everything from, you wouldn't believe like how the tablecloths are folded at the corners, the distance, like if we have like a top level ticket, accessible areas where they get like tabled seating, and like the distance between the notepad and the pen from the edge of the table, like that level.
Wow.
By the way, Tony V is an incredible person. I think he's probably OCD, but like that, and he trained the team for like how to get everything so that it was like you would literally stand there, look along the line, and it was all like it was like it had been put out by a machine. It was that perfect. Wow. But those are the little things. When you've got that level of attention to detail and that level of standards, because it's not about the pad and the pen, it's about what that represents, which is super high standards. And then when you take those super high standards and you apply them across the board, you get a world-class event.
Yeah. But that's why I think it works so well, because everyone I've met, and obviously I'm in the events industry, and Expert Empires was one of the last events that I actually came across, not because I didn't know it was there, but the dates never lined up. Sure. And so when I got there, and I obviously knew you by then already, I was like, now I see what everyone says, because they do say Expert Empires is the event, like the quality is amazing. For you, when you obviously took the leap, you said it's not a big leap, but you took the leap. In my opinion, I'm still like, wow, when you first got your first big speaker and the commitment and so on. It must have been nice having them focusing on that detail so you could focus on doing what you do great, which is obviously sourcing these incredible guests. Tell me about what was going through your mind when you first put your hand in your pocket, which was not a small amount of money to invest. What was going through your mind, and how did you do it to get your first big speaker?
Yeah, I think the first thing is actually when you're the first piece is to have the self-awareness as to what your genius is or what your primary skill set is. So I know that my genius is not actually attention to detail. Even though I walk into a room and the first thing I'll notice is the thing that's not quite right. That said, because my genius is setting the vision for the company, and as far as the event goes, like visualizing this event and going, like, who do I want to speak? What do I want the experience to be like at a high level? I think it's then really important, if that's who you are, to then surround yourself with people that know how to execute the detail. If you're a detailed executor, then you need to surround yourself with people who can do the other bit. So I think first of all, it's having the self-awareness. I will now actually answer the question, which is like, how did I handle the decision to go for it with Expert Empires? I talk about this a lot when I teach people how to manage cash flow in their businesses, because at the time, the costs of running that first Expert Empires event were around about £200,000. And at the time, when I was making the decision, I only had in the current account about 20 odd thousand. So there was a big gap. But I knew it was, I think whenever you're making a decision, you should probably tap into equal parts logic and emotion. And the logical part of my brain had a spreadsheet with, here are the costs, and worst case scenario, here are the revenue numbers. Like, if we only sold this many tickets, if I only managed to get this much in sponsorships, if I only managed to make this many sales at the event, like worst case scenario, I'm going, it's still going to make money. It's still going to be profitable. So logically, I went, I know it makes sense. And emotionally, I really wanted to do it. I felt that it was what the UK events industry needed at the time. And also, I wanted to do it. I felt compelled to. So there was logic and emotion, and then all I needed to do was go, right, if I know the numbers stack up, it feels the right thing to do, how do I make this work? And so, then it was just a simple exercise of playing the cash flow game and going, right, okay, how can I fund this? And I explored loads of different avenues, which you've heard me talk about at Mastermind or at our events. So, I found ways to fund the 200,000, and there were various ways I did that. I actually, in the end, didn't borrow any money to do it. It was just playing the cash flow game, as I like to call it, that meant that it was viable. And best thing we ever did from the business point of view, rapidly increased. Expert Empires didn't exist before that event. That brand was born with that event. Launched a new brand, had a big impact on my, personal brand, I guess. Attracted a lot of new clients to us, made a big noise about, the fact that we were doing it. I often tell the story, before the event even happened, I went over to a conference in America in San Diego called Traffic and Conversion Summit, which is a great event. Who I now know the guys that run it quite well, Ryan Dice, Roland Fraser, Richard Lindner, great guys. They get anywhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people to that event a year. Amazing event. And I remember going to that event. I'd been to it for 3, 4, 5 years previous. And I remember I went to that event and all of a sudden things had changed. I was getting people coming up to me going, oh, you're the guy that's bringing GaryVee to the UK. I'm like, oh yeah, I am. And they're like, we've got a party tonight on this yacht with all the TNC speakers. Do you want to come? I'm like, yeah. So, but like that never happened before. So, those are the things that I go, that wasn't on my spreadsheet. I wasn't equating, I'll invest £200,000 in this event to get this return. I wasn't equating the connections that I'd make as a result. And, pretty much every big name US speaker we've had since has come as a result of some of the connections I made at that event as a result of getting Gary to the first one. Once you've had one big name, now all of a sudden other people take notice. Yeah. When I remember I approached Grant Cardone, and obviously he's like never heard of me. He's going, well, who the hell is this guy? And I'm going, well, this event, Expert Empires. Last year we had Gary Vaynerchuk. This year I want you. And he's like, straight away, he knows what Gary's fee is. He knows that I'm not just messing around and that I can back this up because we've done an event with Gary. So hence we got a grant. That was the first time we'd ever done an event in the UK. That was actually at the time the biggest event we'd ever run. So like I think making the decision was partly logic, partly emotion. But I think what's always interesting is when you make these big plays, there's so many other things, benefits that you never even imagined when you made the decision that come as a result.
Why Gary?
I was fanboying Gary for years.
Really?
Yeah. I was watching, funnily enough, a friend of mine, I haven't seen him for years, but a great guy called James Lavers, really, really good at teaching people how to speak on camera. That's his genius. And, you know, he spoke at some of my events back in the day. And he was like getting into more and more kind of video marketing. And he was like, look, I think you should do more video marketing. You should, you know, like use video more in your marketing and have a YouTube show and all that. And he went, your style is a bit like a GaryVee. And I was like, who the hell's GaryVee? And he's like, oh, you should check him out. He's got this thing called Wine Library. And I'm like, at the time, I have no interest in wine. I've developed a bit of an interest in wine now, as I've got a bit older, but yeah, I was like, I've got no interest in wine. He was like, I know, but watch the guy's show called Wine Library TV, because he went, how he does it, his style, his energy, how he went, I think you're quite similar. So I started watching Wine Library TV, and again, like, I wasn't interested in wine, but I started watching this show religiously. And then he created the Ask GaryVee show, which was more about business, which was right up my street. So I started watching that obsessively, you know, reading his books, became a bit of a fanboy. And then when I came up for the concept for Expert Empires, I was like, who do I want to get? He was my number one. I was like, I want to get GaryVee to come and speak. Wow. Yeah. And I think he'd done a couple of talks in the UK before, but they weren't like widely marketed and publicised. And they were smaller events. So even though it wasn't the first time he'd done anything in the UK, I think to a lot of people it felt like it. So that was a good play. And
you knew you'd met him before
Gary.
He came, GaryVee.
Yeah, I went to see him when he spoke. He was launching one of his books. I forget which one it was. And they had like a book launch event in London, so I went to that event.
Right, okay.
It's a long story which I won't bore you with.
Yeah.
I'll tell it at the events. But I went to the book launch, won by pure fluke, our one-to-one with GaryVee, and then in that one-to-one we had a conversation which started the process of him then coming and speaking at Expert Empires.
Wow. It's so inspiring, Nick, because I think so many people are sat here going, Nick James has had some of the best celebrities around the world, and you've literally sat like this distance from them and asked them some incredible questions. And now to hear the story of how it all started, I think inspires a lot of people. Of the people that you've interviewed, you've spoken to, who would you say has inspired you the most?
Oh, you can't ask me that.
I can.
Yeah,
whether you answer or not, it's your choice.
No, you know what? Like, I think, by the way, something that people should hear as well is, yes, we've had some amazing speakers, you know, big celebs, stuff like that. Most of the time I've just asked. I didn't have any in to Grant Cardone at all. Now, a lot of the speakers more recently, now I've built my brand and I've built more connections, I can pretty much get to anybody with one connection. But, you know, I got Grant Cardone. No. I went on his website, phoned his office. I went, hello, who do I speak to about booking Grant to speak at one of my events? And they went, oh, we need to put you through to so-and-so. They put me through. I was like, hey, I want Grant to come and speak at one of my events. They went, okay. Like, I don't think that's a normal call or inquiry they get. Like, you know, normally there's probably an agency that deals with it or whatever. And I ended up getting through eventually to speak to his number two. And I was like, I'm in the UK. I did this event with GaryVee. I want to do bigger and better this year I want Grant to be the headliner. We looked at the dates. He could make it. I went, what's the fee? They told me. I shit a brick. And then I went, you know what? Like, I think it's going to be worth it. Because again, I don't think he'd done anything in the UK before that, so it was pretty huge. So yeah, I just phoned. I literally just went on his website and went, oh, there's a phone number. I'll just phone it and see what happens. Yeah. Sometimes you just got to ask. I am partly avoiding the question, but I will get to it. So, what do you say? Who's inspired me most? So many of them in so many different ways. David Goggins was amazing. Seriously intense dude, really intense. But he was amazing. Just like the guy's almost not human. He's such a machine. But he was really inspiring. I remember I asked him what his daily routine is, and he went on stage. This was in front of a load of people, and he went, "I don't think you want to know." And I went, "No, I do." He went, "Trust me when I tell you, you won't want to know." And he told me, and I was like, "That is ridiculous." And partly I know what he meant when he said I didn't want to know, because when you look at what he does physically a day, I go, I'm so far away from that. Like, and I'd never want to do it. It's just, it's ridiculous. So I found him really inspiring, really fascinating. I mean, I haven't always done interviews. A lot of them have been keynotes as well. So I think, I guess Marie Forleo was great. I interviewed her when we did the Expert Empires Global event. So it was an online event during COVID. And then she came and headlined an event live in the room. She was great. Really, really enjoyed Marie. Joe Wicks was the last one. He was cool. I really enjoyed Joe Wicks, actually. I thought he was great.
He was just very humble. I think we were all so surprised, weren't we? He was like, you actually still act really human.
Yeah, you know what? I actually wasn't that surprised. Partly because of, like, I think how he comes across on his YouTube channel, and when you see him on TV, he's a bit like that. And you know, when I met him pre being on stage as well, just I wasn't. I think who he is on camera is who he is off camera. So yeah, I think I wasn't that surprised how the interview went, but he was really, really good. We've had some great ones. So yeah.
You've shared so much of it. And obviously, I've been at a lot of those Expert Empires, so I can vouch for a lot of them. And I know you're not allowed to say who's coming up next, but I would highly recommend people are getting tickets to that next event, which is coming up in just a couple of months. I'm very excited to be one of the speakers, which will be really exciting. Now, Nick,
well, we can announce that. We just did, so we can announce that. But yeah, by the way, I think what's interesting about the speakers we've had, when you say who inspires you most, the ones that have inspired me most are the ones that they're not on the kind of personal development speaker circuit saying the same things that everyone else is saying. Like, the reason I think Goggins' book was so big, like, and that's why I booked him. Like, literally, I saw people on social media talking about this book from this guy called David Goggins, and I kept, you know, sometimes where, like, you hear about a book and you go, and then you hear it like 3 times in the next 2 days. I was like, okay, lots of people are talking about this book. I better listen to it. I don't read, I listen. I better listen to it. And I was like, this guy's something else. And so again, I just went on his website, contact form, ended up speaking to his assistant and booking him. And we timed that one really well, because literally I was probably at the earlier end of when the book was just getting some momentum, and I booked him, and then his book went mental, but I'd already booked him. And then we started selling tickets, and everyone wanted to come and see him. So, but yeah, I think, the ones that have inspired me most are the ones that you don't, like Joe Wicks talking about how he's built his business. He never talks about that. It's all health and fitness. So it was really interesting to see that side of him and speak to him from that perspective. Those ones that have inspired me most. We've had some great speakers, don't get me wrong, and you know, they're people who speak about business and mindset, and they've been brilliant. But I really like the ones that don't normally talk about that.
Yeah, I love it. Now, you've obviously been incredibly inspiring for us, Nick, today. I mean, even just some of the stuff you've shared, I'm really grateful for you being so open and transparent with us, because, you know, it's a huge thing on the show. We have a tradition on the show where the current guest gets to suggest, who do you think has an inspiring story that we should hear next on the show?
I mean, the list is so long. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to think of somebody who you don't know, because we know a lot of the same people.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try and think of somebody you don't know who's got a really inspiring story. I'm also trying to think of somebody that you wouldn't have to pay a fortune. I'm trying to find that balance. Who's got a really inspiring story? Have you had Carrie Green on?
We haven't yet, no.
Carrie would be brilliant. Okay. So she spoke at a couple of Expert Empires events. Got a great story. I think she'd be brilliant for you. And also, I think her brand really aligns with your Queens in Business brand
course,
as well.
yeah.
So I think Carrie would be brilliant. I'll make an intro.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate that. Well, thank you so much. As I said, it has been so insightful and so inspiring. For anyone that does want to tune into Expert Empires or find out more about Nick's Empire Builders podcast, I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Nick. It's been awesome.
Thanks for having me.